We're starting this. It's kind of a pilot program. It's an experiment, but I hope it goes well, and I hope it's well received. Karen Dawn does her Dawn Patrol newsletter about animals and about other species on the earth besides human beings, and about the interaction and the magic that can come through all of these different species. And I find her newsletter to be so instructive, and it just sheds light on so many things. And so she was here once, and we said, well, let's have her come back, and let's make it a regular thing. So I got to build a whole open for you and a big production element, Karen. It's going to be good. But for now, you just have me saying, how about it for Karen Dawn, everybody? Yeah. Look at you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm having the kind of hair day that calls for a hat.
Yes. Well, that's we're all well familiar with those days, so no problem. Did the storm hit you, by the way? Are you in part of California that might have been
actually in Austin at the moment?
Ah.
I'm back and forth between Austin and Southern California, but I'm
wow. Look at you.
Y'all can all go to hell, and I'm going back to Texas.
All right. Yeah.
Exactly. We're in hell here. It's 106 degrees today. But is this meetup in Los Angeles?
Well, it's a virtual meetup, so people get a Zoom because people will be joining from all over the country, probably. Right. At least we had last time we did anything virtual. We had one from Florida for sure. I thought we had somebody from New England also. So it's a chance to wherever you live in the world to join us. So, but more to the point, I want to get to this orca, and this was the news that broke right after your last appearance with us last week. Tell us what happened.
You were prescient, unfortunately. So you asked about the situation with the orcas, and I think I mentioned that an orca named Lolita, who's also named Toki, and I'm going to talk about her two names, was finally due to be released after 50 years in captivity. And I've been in our movement. I joked that it was since 1850, but it's actually since about 2000. And during that whole time, I've been aware of, from the time I saw my friend Tim Gorski's wonderful film, Lolita, Slave to Entertainment, I've been aware of her plight. And she has been living in the tiniest, there we see what she should be doing in the ocean. She has been living, or had been living, in a tank in the Miami Seaquarium since 1970. So when I became part of this movement in around the year 2000, she'd already been in there for 30 years. And finally, about a month ago, I think it was March this year, actually, time flies, they said, okay, we are going to allow for her to be released back into the Puget Sound, where her mother is probably still swimming. There's about 70 of her family members who are in the Puget Sound.
She was taken from Puget Sound as a...
In 1970, she was taken from Puget Sound. They used to have these horrifying killer whale orca roundups. And this film I mentioned, and some of this is also in Blackfish, but they used to capture these whales from the ocean and round them up into a bay, net off the bay, and then start trying to take the babies. And unlike the dolphin captures, where they actually slaughter all the other animals, all the other dolphins around them, with the orca roundups, they didn't intentionally kill them. But in the roundup that Lolita was taken in 1970, at least one adult whale died trying to. There we see one of the babies there in nets. An adult died trying to get to her baby, and 4 of Lolita's brothers and sisters died once they were behind the net trying to swim through the net to get back to their mothers. And
there's a very powerful bond between the mothers and those calves, and the.
Oh my God!
I think they're called calves. And the reality is, as I remember, Karen, you can tell me if this is right. they're bonded. If not, I think they're with the mother for 2 years or something like that. But they're bonded for life to that pod. Isn't that it,
Yeah.
more or less?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They don't. They're considerably more bonded than we are with our flying across to, Los Angeles or wherever we go.
Right. They
They
stay
stay there.
together. Yeah. So that's why
Absolutely.
this event was it's so brutal, and the fact that you can see some of it is just heartbreaking. Anyway, so
And
this
I
yeah.
would so recommend, I hope you guys will post a link to it for people to look at this film, Lolita, Slave to Entertainment. At minute 3, that's the tank that they had her living
So
in.
this tank is basically like a bathtub that they put this creature in
That's
for its
one
entire
corner
life.
of it, but I think you've got other photos but it's just ridiculous, the size of this tank that they put her in. But in this film, Lolita, Slave to Entertainment, at around 3 minutes in, they start describing the capture, and they've got interviews with people who were there, and then with one of the men who was involved in the capture, who can just never forgive himself. And they talk about the sounds that the whales are making as they're calling to each other. They're just crying and crying, and about the fact that they didn't even have to. What we see there is, as what we're seeing on the screen now, is when they were going after the whales, what happened is that all the males took off trying to be a decoy in one direction, trying to get the people on the boats away from the babies and the mothers, exactly, very much like in human society. But it didn't work. They ended up all in a bay, and they netted off the bay. And once you've got one whale in captivity, you don't even have to worry about netting off the bay for the rest of them, because they won't leave. If one's in captivity and they're all crying and screaming to each other, they're trying to get at the other one. They won't leave them. And as I mentioned, 4 babies drowned trying to get back to their mothers. And in the middle of the night, they took those babies out into the ocean. They slit their tummies open. They stuffed them with stones and sank them to the bottom of the sea. And there's some video there of those. Somebody was very naughty and filmed the babies at the bottom of the sea. It was supposed to have all been beautifully covered up. But years later, these guys who couldn't live with themselves anymore talked about what had happened, and that's
so true. Just a last point on that, and then you can speak to it. But I remember one of the more moving moments early on, I think, in these conversations with those who were involved, the gentleman to whom you referred, saying, "I'll never forget those sounds, and it haunts me every day that I was part of this."
Right. And what we're seeing now on the screen is the tank that she lived in. So when we say a bathtub, you know what? We're being horribly unfair. It's really a lot more like a swimming pool. So she lived her whole life in this swimming pool, and it's not the fact that it was the smallest pool in the country. But you know what? Who cares if it had been twice the size? If you see the capture and you realize what the family was going through as their baby was being kidnapped, and 4 of them drowned, and off she went. And they took 9 babies that day for distribution to marine parks around the country. And by
so that
2000,
they could perform. So they could perform,
yeah, absolutely,
for people.
Absolutely. And then when you
jump through hoops and stuff.
one of these films has, the capture footage interspersed with the performance footage, and it just makes you ill to see these people riding on their backs, and the audiences are watching, and nobody knew at that time what had gone into bringing the whales into these parks. And but that footage actually is from her capture, and that was in 1970. It was one of.
And you
the
were
very
saying
last.
nine were taken, and they
9
were
were taken.
distributed
By the
across.
time I got into the movement in 2000, 8 of them had died. And orcas can live. Their lifespans are very similar to ours. So when Lolita she was 56, 54 when she just died. And I don't know if we actually mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to say, so she's just died. That is the
died
point.
On the weekend. You and I were talking last week that she's finally going to be released. They were training her to get in and out of a sling so that they could transport her back to Puget Sound, where there's people waiting for her, the native tribes there are practically worship these animals, and they were dying to have her back there. And instead of being transported to Puget Sound, she was taken out of this sling dead on the weekend to be probably buried back there.
It's also a fact that these are creatures, of course, that are used to catching live fish. They have to be, and after so many decades now, just having fish, these dead fish, fed to them. There was a kind of a process of re-educating this animal to be able to live in the wild. So there was a process.
I hate to interrupt you, but just to see this photo on the screen now, these are the photos that we just grew up with all of this thinking it was fine. And then when you look at it, having seen the capture footage, and what is that woman doing on that whale's head? And
for those who are just listening, there's a whale popping out of the water, and there's one of the trainers that is on the whale's front, like nose, as the whale comes out.
Fun. Yeah, lots of fun. And people don't realize that. Well, of course, these whales are willing to do these tricks. That's how they get fed. And,
they keep them hungry, and they feed them. Yes. It's such a tragic life of confinement. So. Let me ask you so it's sad in itself, but let me just ask you a little more of a holistic question.
Yes.
There is an awakening, okay? There is the Blackfish, the other movie that we will do a link. Albert, you'll make sure you put a link in there in the description to the film that Karen was talking about. It's called, what was it called again? Sorry.
Lolita, Slave to Entertainment.
Lolita, Slave to Entertainment. There is an awakening now to the fact that this is going on. We don't now see the sea worlds and marine worlds of the world in the same way. We don't like the confinement of these creatures. We don't even necessarily like the confinement at zoos. I mean, we see everything in a little bit more informed fashion. Absolutely. Is that world changing is my question. I mean, is there movement on this stuff?
There is. And I remember you asked something similar last week. And I said that what's changing is not so much the conditions that the whales are in, but that, as you just said, the awareness is there. And we really saw that with the coverage of Lolita or Toki's death. And I'm going to talk about those two names in a moment. But pre-Blackfish probably, and pre the Cove, she would have died, and the coverage would have just said, "Oh, our beloved Lolita, who we all loved so much, has died, and isn't it sad?" And thank heavens, a lot more of the coverage now with her death is what a freaking tragic life she had. Now that's most of the coverage, but there are exceptions, and I'm sorry to say some of the coverage that really riled me up the most is the New York Times, in their opening two lines, referred to her as an it just before it was supposed to be released back into the sea. And thank heavens, there are not very many news outlets who did that, but we've still got a ways to go if the New York Times is still calling her an it. And then it also referred to I thought this was the most bitterly ironic line. It referred to a celebration of her life.
Yeah,
like,
it's so her life.
What?
I mean, what life did she have? It's like,
oh my God,
yeah.
Maybe if you want to celebrate her life until she was 4 years old.
Right.
But she didn't.
I just want to mention this now, especially since we're going to visit with you regularly. One of the things I like about what you do is that you focus on the way newspapers, television, radio, etc., media, in other words, describes a lot of these stories, these animal-related stories, because that's important. Just like politics, we always talk about media and politics because media handles the messaging around so many things that are political. Media does handle the messaging around things that are related to the animal kingdom. Absolutely. And so, as you say, when the New York Times says it's released, you've made it an it. It's not a thing. It's this highly intelligent, sentient creature with maybe more powers of understanding and certainly for its environment than we would ever have. And yet it's called and reduced to an it. So I love that you underscored that. Okay, we only have a couple
And
more minutes. Move me on. I'm
oh
sorry.
darn,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just want to say about that
yeah.
it
Please.
thing, that the Times was actually violating its own policy there, in that we've been in touch with the Times before when they've called other animals its, and the official Times policy back when it had an ombudsman, the ombudsman responded and said that once an animal was given a name by humans, then they are expected to refer to that animal as a he or a she. And I don't love the fact that, the animal becomes a non-object once we humans have named the animal, but at least stick to your
Yeah.
own policy on that. So for them to call her, and it was upsetting. I wanted to mention with Toki versus Lolita, I had thought that Toki was Tokutai, or Toki was a name that came after Lolita, but it turns out she'd originally been called Toki. But then when she was after she was captured, she was brought to a tank, and there was a whale from her pod there originally called Hugo. And Hugo was much, much older than her. And he had been all alone in this tank since his capture, and they introduced Toki into it. And because of the big age difference between them, and they made it a few times, she was hilariously renamed Lolita, because after Nabokov's Lolita, which is just, so funny. And so once I learned that, I became less excited about calling her Lolita. Hugo, her tank mate, used to ram his head against the wall and died a few years after from a brain aneurysm. And that's why she was alone in the tank for the next how many years, though not entirely alone, because she had a dolphin who is now alone in the tank, living with her. And that's what I mentioned to you, Mark, is that we're getting more awareness about orcas, but dolphins suffer just as horrendously. And so PETA and folks like that are calling now for the release of this dolphin, please, into a seaside area. And I had mentioned that I really hope that you guys would also put up a link to a story called Keiko, the Untold story, because there's a lot of propaganda out there about the release of Keiko from Free Willy, about his release having failed. No, it didn't. He lived for years, swimming freely, swimming to Norway. And yes, he eventually died of pneumonia. Sometimes that happens, but it didn't fail. And we can release these poor beings who are stuck in captivity. And
I love that you mentioned that. Albert, will you link to that as well? So we'll have both the link to the film, and we'll also have a link to that piece, right, Albert?
Yep, I'll have both. Thank you.
Okay, cool. That'll be in the description of this.
Albert, thank you.
I urge it's Keiko is not free. It's $3.99. I urge folks to spend that $3.99 and watch that movie. It will, especially if you've heard that release failed.
No, that's terrific. I can't wait to see it. I haven't seen the movie either.
You'll love it.
Karen, I love that you, in a way, end with something positive. In other words, that the Keiko story actually is a positive story in the end.
Yes.
And the other thing I would just mention, because you talk about the tank, and it just comes to mind, I think it's a good opportunity to mention this fact, is that, they put these creatures in this tank, and because they look the same to us, they figure, oh, great, well, now they've got company or whatever it may be. These creatures don't even speak the same language or act the same way. It leads to all kinds of fights. When I say creatures, I'm talking about the whales and the dolphins. They are... Yeah. They're separate. They look the same, but they are not the same. And it leads to...
I would definitely say far better for her to be in there with a dolphin than completely alone. But yes, it's not.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. I mention it more in the context of creatures of the same size, because there are a lot of fights and even deaths as a result of conflict. Yeah, over territory within this limited space. I mean, these are normally creatures that swim out over many miles. So look, we can go on and on, because I find the whole situation outrageous, and I too, didn't know it, for years, but.
It is outrageous. We'll look back on it like we looked back on, feeding the Christians to the lions. What on earth were we doing? That's how we'll look back on it.
Right on.
I'm going to ask your listeners also to investigate Corky's situation. She was taken from the British Columbia waters at around the same time, and she is stuck in SeaWorld in San Diego. And PETA and folks like that are trying to get her out of there.
There are always ways to get involved. They do respond to public pressure, you know.
Absolutely.
And Karen, it's dawnwatch.com. You can see that there, dawnwatch.com. And Karen keeps you apprised of everything going on in the animal community. I mean, your stuff is really so good. Thank you for joining us. I love that you'll be a regular, and I look forward to next week. Thanks, Karen.
I so appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Karen Dawn, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.